Welcome back. I hope you had a restful weekend. Today in the New Testament by Pentecost Reading Challenge, we complete our reading of the Gospel of Matthew with chapters 26 through 28. We are a week into our celebration of the season of Easter, and I delight in how this reading schedule lets us revisit these stories. In this unusual year, how does hearing them again this week move you? Like Mark and Luke, Matthew depicts a single year of activity by Jesus, a claim mainly based on a single Passover being noted in the text. The Passover is an annual festival to remember and celebrate God's liberation of Israel from Egypt, as told in Exodus chapter 12. The synoptics, a term meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels, all depict the Last Supper as a Passover meal. Prior to the destruction of the temple, Jews from around the world would travel to Jerusalem prior to the Passover to purify themselves and celebrate there. In an age of frequent rebellion, these mass crowds would have made the Roman and Jewish authorities especially nervous. Some key insights to consider. Jesus appears to the disciple on the mountains. Big things happen on mountains in Matthew and often in the Bible, particularly the stories of Moses and Mount Sinai. While it certainly could be literally what happened, the focus and parallel Matthew emphasizes seems to be a deliberate framing by the author to call our attention to Jesus as divine revelation. Crucifixion was a horrific Roman punishment designed to humiliate its victim and deter others. It was reserved for state criminals, but it was not at all rare. Sometimes we think of the crucifixion as a singular event, but rather crucifixion was quite common and is documented in multiple historical sources and places. One particular rebellion was crushed with reports of some 2,000 crucifixions lining a main road. Imagine the horror. Since crucified victims were usually left on display after death, it was particularly horrific for Jews of the time, as their practices required burial by sunset on the day of death. Note the powerful images of the moment of Christ's death in chapter 28, verse 51, an earthquake, resurrection of the dead, and the curtain of the temple being torn from top to bottom. I mentioned that scene in my Easter sermon, and will deal more with that last image when we turn to Hebrews next week. Jesus' resurrection appearance and final words to his followers in Matthew's Gospel combine affirmation, imperative, and promise. The affirmation, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. The imperative, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Popularly known as the Great Commission, this is the classic foundation of Christian missionary work. Borg notes that in the first century Jewish context, nations is less about distinct countries, but basically means Gentiles, i.e., everybody who's not Jewish. The risen Christ specifically expands the mission and what the disciples were told back in chapter 10, verse 5. And promise. The final words, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age, returns to the opening promise of this gospel. In chapter 1, Matthew, citing Isaiah, describes the newborn Jesus as Emmanuel, God dwelling with us. Here, the risen Christ says the same thing about himself. On his deathbed, John Wesley's last words were, the best of all, God is with us. This is the central promise of the Gospels and of Paul's writings. God became flesh and dwelt among us. God is transcendent, but also immanent. God is all-powerful, but became vulnerable. God suffers with. God does not coerce, but calls. Blessings on your reading.